words that I use is peachy. If somebody asks me how things are, and I'll say peachy, and usually they didn't know that it's not. I don't know exactly what peachy means, but for me it means no comment. And so if you ever ask me how things are and I say peachy, usually that'll mean I just don't want to say everything is okay. Who likes grapes? Anybody like grapes? Now, if you look at that picture, and I was to say, first thing that came in your mind when you saw it, anybody? Concord, okay. How about Andrew? That might work. Okay, that's one of the things I thought of. Their son is one of the leading vineyardologists, and so anybody else? Anybody else? First thought that jumped into your mind when you saw the grapes? Same thing. Louder.
Seedless.
Yeah. Okay. I will tell you this: that my ancestors grew grapes with seeds on just one side, inside, and so. My dad used to tell that all the time as a flashback, okay. Anybody else, you saw that? How many of us would think about to die? About to die. You realize that when the grapes grow, they hang. And if they're not supported well, anybody ever seen the way they support them? If they're not supported well, these clusters of grapes will hang all the way down, and if they get in the dirt, guess what will happen to them? They will all die. The bottom one will get dirty, and it will send it right up the vine. And so how important is it that when you have a cluster, you stay as high as you can be? Now, how many of us, when we have trouble in our life, we have clusters? It would be one thing if it was just this, or if it was just this and this, but it's just this, and this, and this, anybody know? And this, and this. And did you know, one or two of those things, you would say, I would be able to stay, keep those up high. But when they have 5, 6, 7, 10, 12, 30, all of a sudden, I am so weighed down by the fruit that ought to bring me up that I can't it's hard to do good things because of all of the other things that are weighing me down. I read an interesting article this week and it said 7 things you need to know about church. This is the one thing we need to know. Sean today is going to be possibly affirmed into membership. Now I say possibly because some of us could say we don't choose to affirm. But why would anybody want to join a church these days? Now this is one of the questions us elders are debating when we get together and talk. Because the thing is that this whole article, 7 things you need to know about church, was why not to go? And they said because you'll get burned out. Don't go to a church, don't join a church, because they'll definitely burn you out. Then you'll have bad experiences. You'll not only have burnout and bad experiences, there will be so many distractions. You'll say, I want to go to church, but the 4-H is today, and I want to go to church, but this is today. Did you ever notice that all those things always happen on Sundays? Now, how many of us remember the days when we had midweek Bible study? Well, you should remember because we had midweek Bible study here in this church every week. We have it on Tuesday nights. It's not Wednesday. I don't know if Wednesday is technically midweek, but there we're talking work week. I'm just talking about middle of the week Bible study. We have that. We have Awanas. We have youth. We have so many programs that if we're ever being weighed down, you've got plenty of opportunities to come back and get lifted up. In fact, a couple of weeks ago at the Tuesday night Bible study, at the end of the Bible study, I said, are there any prayer requests? And they said, I just want to say that I really did not want to be here tonight. And the first thing, what are they going to say next? I really did not want to be here tonight. And this is what she said. But I am so glad I was. It will change the rest of my life. There will be burnout. There will be bad experiences. There will be distractions. There will be life changes. I've known couples that the husband got excited about the Lord, and although the wife had been attending the church longest, she did not get more excited about the Lord, and their marriage actually got difficult. I've seen families where the kids come to youth group and go home and say, we want to get saved, to the point where one child was willing to walk away from his college scholarship in baseball so he could be on the ministry team at our church. And this is what their parents said, who was a deacon at our church. Fire the youth pastor. Because he's brainwashing the kids into thinking that the only valuable life is the godly life. Fire the youth pastor. I wish I could have just fired a few deacons. Okay, life changes. There's going to be mistakes. I can remember a pastor talking, we were talking in a group one day, and this one pastor, we were saying, have you made any mistakes that were irreconcilable? You just never fixed them. He said, I did. He said, woke up one day, and for some reason I didn't check my calendar, and sure enough, I had a funeral. And he said, I got there basically just as the funeral should have been over. And he said, and with that family, that mistake was too big of a mistake. I never was able to reconcile with that family. He ended up leaving the church. We can all make mistakes, amen to that? And yet, what do we do when we make a mistake with people who supposedly love us, who we supposedly love? There will be power struggles. Now, it may not look like a power struggle, but it can come off as a power struggle, and it may be a power struggle. I don't know how many times that the pastor has been the most worst person to deal with in the church. Anybody ever been in one like that? And so, the answer was, I can remember somebody saying at a meeting that when people come up to him, they would say this, well, I know the answer is going to be no, but... And that was from the pastor. I've had the unusual situation where pastors' wives come and want to have counsel because of what their pastor husband was being like. And then lack of connection. Now, one thing that was reported about this church a few weeks ago is that this is a great church for music, that this is a great church for Bible study, this is a great church for youth programs, but in the confines of this room, they felt that they were not greeted, they felt that they were not welcomed, they felt that they came and left and nobody said anything to them. Now, I don't even know if that's true, but that's their opinion of us now. How important is it that when we come in, now I know we talked in Sunday school a few weeks ago about when we come in, we should get quiet and ready for worship. But when you're out there in the parking lot, you should be hunting people down to say good morning to. In fact, I would encourage you not even to come in here until it's time for us to be quiet and get ready for church. Now, wouldn't it be great if we had a big church with a great big narthex? Anybody ever use that word lately? Narthex. That's the way we say it in Georgia, narthex. Some people call it a vestibule. In other words, a great big place where you could greet each other so that you could do all of that fellowship and then say, let's go to worship, and actually bring them in and sit down with them. What could be worse than a visitor to come in and be sitting and not knowing that we all sit on this side and have one person sitting over here on this side? I told the Tuesday night crew, if you see somebody sitting alone, go sit with them. Don't let anybody be sitting alone. There will be life changes, there will be lack of connection. And so these are the 7 things I know. And let me just tell you, they are all true. Amen to that? Now, what do we do when they're all true about us? The very things that should be bringing us the great cluster of fruit, that refreshing, that beautiful taste, those wonderful, just look at that, it just makes me want one. And that's the way it should be with church. Now, we're going back on our missionary journeys with Paul today. And so we're going on the 2nd missionary trip. But you'll find out that before we can even get there, boy, you can't even see that. How many of us know that there's a map of the Promised Land up there? Can you see it? Okay. And so we've got that a little bit opaque out. We'll be filling that in, as well as where most of those places are in contemporary geography. So the very places where the Christians are being killed were the very places that Paul and Barnabas went and started churches. Except for way over here on the continent of Africa. And so, wow, let's recap. Paul and Barnabas, actually when the mission team left Antioch, it was Barnabas and Saul, Paul, and the main one of the team was Barnabas. Anybody remember what his surname or his reputation name was? Son of Encouragement. Wouldn't you like that to be your nickname? That every time somebody said, just being in your presence made them feel better. Just being in your presence. Now, they go on their first mission trip approximately AD 47. They return in late 48, beginning of 49. So the mission trip was only about 1 to a year and a half. 1 year to a year and a half long. Maybe you could say real close to 2, but nothing over that. We find all of this in Acts 11 through 14. They go 1,581 miles walking, except for the little jaunt they took out to the Isle of Crete. And so, which is, you can't see it on that map, but it's right under the word miles. I'll try to get a better map next week so that we can see those a little better. Did you know that it would be a 53-day trip just to walk it? If you go and retrace those steps today, it would take you 53 days of walking just to make it there. Now we do know this, that they stopped at strategic places along the way long enough to build a church, if not churches. And so 53 days out of 356 days in a year, approximately what? 25% of the time was in transportation. The other 75% of the time was in planting churches, building relationships, and getting things started. At the cost of 237 denarii per person for the trip. Now, if you were to go like on a singing group and go to Europe and sing and things like that, you have to drum up your own support. Where did their support come from? Well, it came from the church at Antioch, not Jerusalem. The church at Antioch. Did you realize the church of Jerusalem was so poor, the little people in Philippi, who didn't have hardly any money, took up an offering and sent it back to Jerusalem? That would be like us taking up an offering and sending it to First Baptist Church, Dallas, Texas, that has 50,000 members. Just because you have 50,000 members does not mean you're making budget. Amen to that? Okay. And so 237 denarii per person, and we know this, on the mission trips, Paul spends the majority of his time working, so that means he was fully funded. How important is it if we send somebody on a trip that they be fully funded? Now, I got all this information because I've been reading this book. Have you ever wondered how much Paul's missionary journeys would have cost? It was written by a guy by the name of Josh Chalmers in 2012. Interesting book, because instead of just talking about where they went, they talked about what were some of the real dynamics in their time, the socio-economic and socio-political situations. Not just what did they preach on, but what did they have to live through during that process of time. We're going to 49 AD right now today. They have been to the council at Jerusalem. Now the council at Jerusalem, the purpose of that was to discover whether or not they thought Gentiles could actually come to Christ. Think about that just for a minute. Did Jesus really die for everybody, or did he just die for the Jews? Did you realize Jesus is put to death on approximately April 3rd of the year 33? Somebody really quick do the math. 33 to 49 is how many years? How many? 33 to 49. 16 years? And they still don't know if you can become a Christian officially. 16 years later, they still don't know if a Gentile can really get saved. Could you imagine that? Doesn't that seem like the wheels were grinding too slow? Have you ever been in a church like ours that sometimes decisions need to be made and they can take a year or two before we can work out all of the questions, before we can even understand what any of the answers are? I would rather go slower and get it right than to go faster and have to fix the brokens that I broke in the fix. And so 16 years they're still doing this. Now, we find in Acts 15, very end, I'm going to ask you to turn there with me, to Acts chapter 15, we also find out in Galatians chapter 2. Now, at this particular time, what's going on in the big house? And that's in Rome. And in Rome, Emperor Claudius says, we don't want to have Christian Jews or Jewish Jews in our city anymore. Now, you would say, wait, that could never happen. Could it? Watch the news. What's going on in the world today? There are places in the world today who says what? If you're anything other than our official faith of the land, our caliphate, you are what? You are cordially invited to leave Earth. How many of us know that the word, most of the words where we get the Muslim religion means to submit? And there are two versions of submit in the Quran. You either submit to the teaching and convert, or you submit to the sword and die. Those are the only two. And so when people say, oh, well, Muslims is such a nice religion, they've never read the Quran. They've never known the concepts. What we're seeing, that's not radical Islam, that's Islam. Now, there are some people who don't even read the Quran who still think they're Muslims. Just like there are some people who never read the Bible and say they're Christians. And they don't even know that they don't know what they're talking about. in the Christian faith. Well, I think God would be like this. Well, why would you think that? What did Pastor Darrell teach us last week in Sunday school? That we have an elephant in the room. And the only way for us to know what the elephant really is if the elephant does what? Speaks to us. And who is the greatest elephant in the world? God Almighty. And the only way for us to know the elephant is for the elephant to speak. And he did it in two different ways. He did it through his living Son, and he did it through his living Word. So if we want to know God, the only place to know God is not just go out in the pastures and pray by yourself. It's not to call somebody else that doesn't know anything about the Bible either. It's to open up the Bible. Do you need to have a master's degree or a doctorate degree to understand it? No. It is so simple. Anybody can understand it. But Claudius is expelling all the Jews, and then the preparations are being made. Anybody make preparations before a trip? Any kind of a trip. What are some of the preparations we make? Anybody? Packing?
Packing list.
Packing list. I can't even pack without a list. Okay. What else? Anything? Reservations. How many of us have ever said, I'll wait till I'll get there and I'll find a room? Okay, what else? How about?
Dog sitter.
Yeah, dog sitter. Somebody to watch your animals. I've got Carol's cards, so if anybody needs one of Carol's cards, I got her cards. I will be happy to distribute for you. How about if you're going to go overseas, exchanging of money and at least understanding what the money means? I can remember one morning I was in England, and I wasn't used to using all the British currency before they went to the euro. And the milkman came, knocked on the door. Anybody remember the milkman? The milkman came with these little bottles of milk. And he said, that will be a certain amount of money. And it was 16p. I didn't know what p meant. I gave him 16 pounds. Anybody know that's 100 to 1,000 times more money than the price? And this is what the guy said. He said, you from America? And then he gave me back my money. He said, I'll come back later and we'll teach you how to count coins and currency. Now, sometimes you have to change your coins and maybe get a passport and all these other things. What do you think Paul and Barnabas needed to do before they could go on their mission trip? Well, first of all, I had to write the book of Galatians, because that church was in a mess, or those churches. And then there was the rise of the Zealots. Now, anybody ever hear of the Zealots? The Zealots became a religiously fanatical group because all of these influences from Rome and from Greece, specifically though from Rome, were so infiltrating the Holy Lands that they said, we have made a vow to kill anybody who's not a Jew, if we can find them. Now, what did God tell the Jews to be throughout the whole Old Testament? To be a light to the Gentiles, not a knife to the Gentiles. And so their whole job description as a people group was to reach the world. And yet they were at the time of about 100 BC when they were tearing everything down in Rome, and Rome was building everything back up until they rebuilt the Temple of Solomon about 19 BC. We have all these people starting to become, they didn't become a strong movement until about the year 48, 49. So strong that they were willing to go up into a castle high up on a hill with all of their wives and all of their children. And when Rome circled the hill, they said this, we will kill our wives and we will kill our children and we will kill ourselves, but you will never have dominion over us. And so they did. And so they did. Making plans. Now, let's begin reading. Acts chapter 15, I'm going to begin reading in verse number 36. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we have proclaimed the word of the Lord and see how they are now. Wouldn't that be a legitimate thing to do? That if you're going to start a church, wouldn't it be good to go back? Margaret and I went on a mission to the Tohono O'odham tribe in Arizona, sometimes called the Bean Eaters or the Papagos. Anybody ever hear of them? And we had to clear it through the tribal elders before we were allowed to go onto the reservation. We had to clear it, and they allowed us to go to 2 different cities. We could stay in one city to sleep, and we could go out to a place called Covered Wells, and we could teach. Now, Covered Wells was just literally a series of dirt floor huts, and then a communal bathroom in the middle, sort of like a KOA. And I can remember the first day we were there, Margaret went into the bathroom and ran out of the bathroom, and she said, I'm never going back in there again. And I thought maybe it was because of the sanity. It was because of the animals. The big lizards. Yeah. I think she was yelling, Godzilla, Godzilla. Something like that as she came running out of it. They said, let's go back to the very places where we have been. Now, we went on missionary, and we would have to go and start the mission at about 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the morning. We were doing vacation Bible school. How many of us would get up and get your kids to church at 6:30 in the morning? Well, that's because it was still under 110. You see, if we'd have waited till 11, it would have been 120, 130 out in the desert sun. And so in order to have it while it was still the cool of the day, we had it at 6:30 to 7 o'clock in the morning. So we had to leave the compound. It was about 25 or 30 miles. We had to leave the compound at 4:30 or 5 just so that we could be there, so that we could have Bible study. And then here we are making snow cones at 6:30 in the morning, and making water balloons. Now, we would make water balloons and put them in a cooler to keep them cool, because have you ever been hit by a 120-degree water balloon? And so we did everything we could, and we did games, and we did everything. And at the end of the week, I gave an invitation, and how many people lived there? About 30? We had 25 accept Christ. So I looked at the missionary that day, and I said, "You're going to start a church out here?" He goes, "Oh, no." I said, "Well, you're going to come out here and get them and bring them to church?" "Oh, no." I said, "Well, what's going to happen to them?" They said, "Well, if you come back next year, they'll get to see you again." In other words, what was he telling me? That they are not going to have another gospel presentation unless God did it independently without any of the mission groups for another year. And you know there's verses in the Bible that says this, that sometimes people try to clean up their house and they can't do it, but somebody will tell them about the Lord and they'll clean out their house, but they won't put any godly back into it, and the demons that left will bring 7 more demons back with them, and the second relationship of that person was worse than the original relationship of that person? Anybody ever read those texts in the Bible? In other words, I said, we might have done better never coming out here. If now they think all the Christians do is come out and desert. And you know, sometimes somebody can say, "I accept Christ," but it takes 2 or 3 or 4 more visits for them to really understand what they did, rather than just doing something because somebody asked you to. Sometimes Native Americans are very easy to want to please. "Wouldn't you like to accept Christ?" "Yes, I will." Same with Brazilians. "Wouldn't you like to accept Christ?" "Yes, I will." And they'll go ahead and accept Christ, say the prayer, and not even know what they did, but they just didn't want to offend you, so they wouldn't say no. I don't know if any of those 24 or 25 really did accept Christ. The only way to know was to go back. And what is Paul saying? What we really need to do, Barnabas, you and I, we need to go back and we need to see, are they staying true? How are they? Are they growing in their faith? I'm worried about them. So Paul says to Barnabas, now verse number 37, now Barnabas wanted to take with them his relative, John, also called Mark. We believe that's the Mark who wrote the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But did you know on the first missionary trip, almost no sooner than they got started, John Mark left. Now I will say this, we don't really know exactly why he left, but we do know this, that Paul considered him a deserter. He didn't think it was a good enough reason. I don't know what the reason was. The Bible never clearly tells us what the reasons were. It just says that he left. And after he leaves, Paul really doesn't want to have anything to do with Barnabas. But let's not forget, what was Barnabas' other name? Son of... Wouldn't you want if all of a sudden you had spiritual burnout, or you all of a sudden had spiritual doubts, and you ran away from what you thought God was wanting you to do, wouldn't you want a Barnabas to come and sit with you and love you and encourage you and bring you back? Or would you like a Paul saying, "No, you're with that person"? Which one would you really want to have in your life? Well, the answer is both. Because sometimes we can be so loving that they never reconcile, but we also don't want to be so firm that they never feel loved. And so Barnabas wanted to bring him. Paul thought it was best. Now notice this. Paul, verse number 38, but Paul thought it was best not to take the one who had withdrawn from them. Now the word here from withdrawn does not necessarily mean desert. It just means went back. And there could be a lot of different reasons. We do know that he lived in a house on straight And so his mother could have gotten sick. Other situations could have happened. I'm not going to make excuses for, but I'm not going to make accusations against either. I'm just going to say this. Barnabas was true to who Barnabas was. Let's bring him along. Paul was true to who Paul was. I don't know if I can trust him. And so now, verse 39. And there arose such a sharp disagreement. We're going to bring him. No, we're not. We're going to bring him. No, we're not. We're going to bring him. No, we're not. The words here for sharp disagreement comes from this word in the Greek. It is two different words put together. The word orge, which means anger, and the word pyro, which means fire. Pyromaniac, anybody ever hear of that phrase? So you put those together and you get a flaming, angered disagreement. It wasn't like you say, well, I don't think so. Oh, maybe, I don't think so. It was, yes, we will. No, we won't. Yes, we will. No, we won't. Yes, we will. No, we won't. It was flaming. Anybody ever had those? And you know, they can start off, shouldn't we? I don't know. And the more you talk about it, sometimes the more sharp the conflict can be. Now, let's not forget, this is happening as they're preparing to go on a mission trip. In other words, who in the mission team, who are the only two people on the team who don't get along? The two leaders of the team. So we have got total, angered, flaming disagreement when they're trying to form a mission trip. Now the question is, who sinned? Because in order to have that kind of disagreement, somebody's got to sin, right? Didn't they run up to Jesus and they said, who sinned? The parents or the child? And remember what Jesus said? Neither. But this is happening so that the glory of God may be revealed. Now, who sinned? The Bible never says that Satan was involved in this in any way. Sometimes we need to know people just differ in opinions. Then what do? Have you ever had a difference of opinion with somebody who's another brother and sister of Christ, maybe even your spouse or your kids? And what do when you have a disagreement? Well, remember what we've been studying? What does John 13, 34, and 35 say? A new commandment I leave with you, that you love one another. By this the whole world will know that you are my disciples, by the way in which you agape one another. In other words, when we disagree vehemently, we've got to remember to still love that person. Now, I've heard a lot of people say this, well, I still love them, I just don't like them right now. If you can say it like this, it's not love. Now, unless you have one of those languages like Japanese, hokta, huda, hokta. I have no idea what I said, but I think I said I love you. So, how about Galatians 6:10? Now, what is our thing to do? Is that in 6:1, if we are mature, and in 6:10, we are supposed to lovingly encourage specifically those of the household of faith. But here is a dynamic that the world needs to hear, and beloved, you need to hear about this church. Is if you belong to this church long enough, you will get hurt. I will let you down. Pastor Darrell will let you down. David will let you down. Not because we want to, it's just we are all human. You will let us down. But you would want us to continue to love you back. We will let you down. And I can say this, how many times do people leave churches on unbiblical precepts? Dealing with conflict godly. Isn't that what we need to do? Because all of us are going to have conflict. Amen to that? Okay, here we go. First of all, let's take a look at the text again. But Paul thought it best not to take them. And a sharp disagreement arose so that they separated from each other. Literally broke off connection. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. Now, that little phrase, having been commended, does not just mean Paul. It means Barnabas and Mark too. It means both groups were commended by the Lord. Not just the last group prior to the comma. And he went off. Now, knowing he, because who's writing this? It's Luke. And who did he go with? With Paul. And so he went off. The best way to deal with conflict is keep it one-on-one. Paul had a problem with Barnabas. Barnabas had a problem with Paul. They didn't go run into anybody else to solve the problem. They didn't go run into anybody else. I can't believe what he said. I can't believe what he did. Anybody know any times that happens? Let me tell you what they said. When they say, let me tell you, just say, talk to them. Talk to them. Paul and Barnabas kept it between Paul and Barnabas. There was an ego check. Now, how many of us get madder because we feel that we have been personally disrespected? And the only way to feel that is to have an ego check. There have been several people in this church where I have said some things and they've said some things to me that were hurtful. And then we hugged. Because why? It wasn't about your ego or personality. It wasn't about my ego. This is what I really think is best. So just tell me the truth. And then let's love each other. They checked their ego. Neither claimed God was on their side. When in our world, you know what the verse where it said, but Paul wanted to say no. And Barnabas would have said, that's what Jesus wants us to do. And Paul would say, no, that's not what Jesus wants us to do. Isn't that the way sometimes arguments go? No? Maybe none of you have this. Just Mark. They were resolution-minded. When we have a problem, notice Barnabas wanted to go on mission. Paul wanted to go on mission. The number one thing was the mission. The number two thing was the people. So Barnabas took John Mark. They stayed resolved in mind that they were, no matter what was going to happen, they would not neglect the call of Christ on their life. If somebody leaves a church and says, well, the Lord doesn't want me at this church anymore, but the Lord has not called them to another church, that's not resolution-minded. That's escapism. They weren't looking to escape the church at Antioch. They were looking to expand the church of Jesus Christ. So they were resolution. Paul chose Silas. Different ideas does not mean sin. Please know that. Just because somebody says, well, I think we need to do it this way, and somebody else on the team says, oh, no, I don't think so, we need to do it this way, doesn't mean one of you are right, one of you are wrong. Just means you've got different ideas. We need to love the source. In other words, the gospel and the church. You see, what happens too many times is say, I'm out of here. I'm through. Anybody ever hear somebody say that? They said, okay, well then, I'm out of here on mission. I'm out of here with the love of Christ. I'm out of here. In other words, I'm still going to go do the ministry. I'm not going to break away from ministry. Barnabas did take John Mark. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9:6. Let's take a look at a couple of passages. Or is it only Barnabas and I who have the right to remain from working for a living? Who does Paul affirm? The very person he had the pyromania, flaming anger disagreement with? Let's take a look at another one in 2 Corinthians. Chapter 8, verse number 18. With him, we are sending the brother who is famous among all the churches for his preaching. Now, both Calvin and Luther and most theologians of the 100 up until about 1500 all believe he was talking about who is probably the most prominent person for loving and encouraging people as they preach. Barnabas. And not only that, but as appointed by the church to travel. Now, who was the only other one appointed by the church to travel? As a leader? Barnabas. Let's take a look at Colossians 4:10. Aristocratus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of... In other words, who is he now on mission with? The very one he didn't want to go on mission with. Let's take a look at 2 Timothy. Chapter 2. Did you know in 2 Timothy, Paul is about to be beheaded? Near the end of his ministry. Verse number 14. Remind them of the things and charge them before God not to quarrel about words. Do you think he was biting his lip? no good, but only ruins the hearers. He goes on to say, and send to me Mark, and have him bring my cloak, because I love him and a cloak. Now, does that sound like such a disagreement that both of them got mad and walked away from the church? In other words, they loved the source. And what was the source of the real argument? Out of the church. But what was their end and net result? Well, let's think about that. Cooperation, not competition. You see, so many times, I've been on church staffs where at a church staff meeting, the senior pastor and the business manager would say this: what have you spent in your budget, and prove it that it needed to be spent? That's a legitimate question. And prove that it needed to be spent. And if you had any surplus money left over out of your budget. Now remember, budget's just a piece of paper with how much money you think it would cost for you to do that ministry that year. Those monies could get reallocated. So that means if the youth pastor still had $5,000 left in his budget, but the air conditioner broke down and the building manager, pastor, said, I need $5,000 to fix the air conditioner, guess what would happen? That money would get reallocated. Because we weren't, they would say, no, that's my money for my program. We never heard that. Because we weren't in competition. We were in cooperation. In other words, the youth ministry was in cooperation with the mowing of the yard ministry. And we're soon hopefully to have an evening ladies Bible study and an evening men's Bible study. And guess what? They're not going to be in competition with each other over space. We're going to cooperate with one another. There's still a lot of balls in the air being juggled. But in other words, they want to serve God. They both wanted to serve God. They both wanted to preach the gospel to people who had not heard it. They both continued, though they went in different directions. But they never stopped serving. When I have somebody come to our church and I'll say, oh, you're new in town? Yeah. Hey, looking for a church? I've been looking for a church home. How long? About 15 years now. What church were you a part of? Well, this other church in Las Vegas. First thing I think is, when Pastor Darrell and I would talk before I came here, the big word is, any red lights or... And when somebody says that to me, huge red light comes on. Huge. Unity and diversity. You ever met someone, they say that opposites attract, but I don't know who they are. Because most of the time when somebody's opposite, we will have conflict. Now, in order to work out something, but wouldn't you rather have someone that would be willing to say, oh, better be careful here, better watch out here, oh, what about this? Maybe, you're not thinking this completely through. And if you check your ego, it shouldn't bother you. Because you should know that that person is really saying what? I love you too much to see you get caught in this mess. Let me help you out here. Division to multiplication. Anybody love math? Those people are brain damaged people like me. But some people love math. They do it for fun activities. Oh, I think I'll sit down and write a matrix today. I don't get it. But then again, I don't get a whole lot. So, what happens, instead of one missionary team with 2 people in it, we have 2 missionary teams with 2 plus. Let's go back to Acts chapter 16 just for a second. Now, Paul came to a place called Derbe and Lystra, and the disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was absolutely Greek, meaning what? Unsaved. Unsaved. He was well spoken of by the brothers of Lystra and Iconium, and Paul wanted Timothy to do what? Be a part of the team. In other words, unity and diversity, the division of Paul and Barnabas actually became the multiplication of more teams going out and doing it. In other words, we reached more people faster because of the disagreement than we would have if they hadn't had the disagreement, because they both dealt with it honestly. What is that? If you have someone that you have conflict with, you might want to write some of these down. Keep it one-on-one. Don't bring anybody else into the conflict. Don't try to say, I'm going to get my supporters and they're going to get their supporters. keep it between you and God and that person. Your ego's got to be checked. And let me tell you, I have a problem with that. Anybody else have a problem with that? Because how many times when somebody says, well, I think you, and the first thing we do is get defensive. Egos have got to be checked. We've got to be resolution-minded all the time. All the time. When a couple comes in and they say, we need marriage counseling, do you know what the first question I ask them is? Do you want to save this marriage? That's the first question I ask. Because if they say yes, then my next statement is, then you'll do whatever it takes, right? But if the answer right off the bat is no, then I have another direction that I go, right? Love the source. Now what is that? The gospel of the church. You see, when I love the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, and I love the church, and what is that? The bride of Christ? Pastor Darrell has been getting us to want to read this book called Dating the Church. There used to be a book that called, it was by Tom Rainier. I just saw it the other night. It was on church hopping. And the concept was, there's a lot of people like coming to a church because they have that new feeling of the honeymoon period. But when the honeymoon period is over, you know what that means? Now we'd like you to serve in the nursery, and now we would like you to possibly mow the lawns, and now we would ask you if you'd like to participate, all the way to church membership, where we'd ask you to say that this is the place that God has intended for you to serve until God opens the door for you to leave. Not until you get hurt. Because we're in competition. No, because we're in cooperation. We're not in competition against your family. Some churches are. I've heard pastors who have said, well, if your wife won't come, you just leave your wife and kids at home, and you just come to this, now hear me, budget meeting anyway. Let me tell you, I don't believe that a budget meeting or an elders meeting is more important than the wife and kids. I don't. I believe it's your relationship with God first, your relationship with your family second, and your relationship with your church third. But that doesn't mean that it's way down the list. Now, if they would have said that they won't come to church, I would have said, well, come to church anyway. They won't come to counseling, I would say, come to counseling anyway. But if they won't come because there is a meeting about the grass, on the decision whether they have grass or flowers in the back of the church, I would say, stay home and take care of your family. Unity through diversity. We need people in every area of the church who has another idea, and let their ideas be just as valid until we work out all the ideas and get all the answers. In other words, when somebody says to me, you know, have you ever thought about such and such? My answer is, no! Of course not. Of course I've thought about that. Of course not. Tell me more. Tell me more. Have you ever heard anybody say there's no such thing as a stupid question? And then you ask one, and they go, you gotta be kidding me, right? Now, didn't they just say there's no such thing as a stupid question? And then you ask the question, and they may as well have said that's a stupid question when they, you gotta be kidding me, right? As I told you, I had seminary students stand at our house, and I was doing adjunct work for Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth. And this one master's level of divinity student looked at me and said, if somebody has open heart surgery and they decide that they have to have heart transplant, do they have to ask Jesus back into their heart again? Now, how many of us went, are you kidding me? Anybody? And I wanted to go, are you kidding me? But I didn't. One of the few times God was able to stop me before it got out. And I asked, do you really think God's invited into a blood pump with the center of the consciousness of the person? Oh yeah, I never thought about it. Church membership matters. Now that doesn't mean we're just trying to get more members. But you know what's unusual about the Church of America today? Is we have got more people leaving the back door of the church than coming in the front door of the church. The church in America today has plateaued, stopped growing, and is declining. Now, praise God, this church isn't really doing that. And yet at the same time, we've got to have a plan before it happens so it doesn't happen, so that we can prevent it. How do we do that? Just take a look at one-on-one. Take a look at resolution minded. Take a look at all of those lists, because I guarantee you that if you haven't already been hurt at church, you will. So the question is not, what are you going to do? The question is, how are we going to love? Now with all that in mind, all of a sudden Sean wants to be a member of this church. He has met with the elders, and it was a blessed meeting, and he is being presented for the last technically 3 weeks for church membership. And during that time period, if anybody would have had something, I'm sure it would have come up. But having heard nothing, I'm going to ask our elders that are here with me, if you'll stand with me.